Hello, and welcome to Getting Started with Power Training. My name is Tim Cusick, and I'm going to take you through the 7 steps of power training. All right, let's start off with comparing power training with heart rate training. Most people, once they invest in a power meter and they start power training, do have experience of training with a heart rate, and understanding the differences are key. Let's compare a couple of the elements of each. So in power training, right, power training precisely measures the exact amount of work I do. I start to do an interval and I go harder, I immediately see the higher power or the watts demanded to go harder. In heart rate, we're actually measuring the response to the work that we do, meaning once I start that interval and go harder, it usually takes 20 to 40 seconds for my heart rate to come up and really show how hard I'm working. So power training precisely measures that exact amount of work. Heart rate is really just measuring the response to that work. That's probably the key difference for power training is you really get to understand, it gives you greater, deeper insight into the stress and then eventually the strain that you're putting on the system. Power training establishes a quantifiable baseline fitness. If you go out and ride your bike as hard as you can for an hour and do 250 watts, that's a baseline fitness. Whereas in heart rate training really only establishes your baseline heart rate. And this shows up in some of the testing and training, and the way that you measure the effectiveness of that testing and training. Power training gives us specific targeted training zones or training targets, where heart rate gives us general targeting zones. So let's talk about these last two kind of together. So let's say you're going to go out and you're going to do a 20-minute time trial as a test, a 20-minute maximal effort, a 40-minute maximal effort. Pick your number, right? Let's say today, I haven't been training for 2 months. I go out and I do my 20-minute maximal test and I hit 250 watts. My personal heart rate would probably be around 165 to 170 at that effort. But then let's say I trained for 8 straight weeks, and then I went out and did the same test. My watts might go up in response to my training to 275 watts, but the reality is my heart rate's probably going to be the same. I was going maximal effort, right? That is the response to the actual work that I'm doing. So I wouldn't expect a big change, maybe a beat or so, just based on, that particular test environment. So if you think about it, that's probably the second largest benefit of power training. You can really measure change in a very quantifiable way. So you get a baseline fitness, you get specific training zones, and it allows you to measure micro changes, small, and even macro changes, right, in your fitness. Heart rate measurement, you need to find a different way to understand that you've gotten faster, stronger, or your training has worked. All right, so let's get into the learning about power training. The reality is, let's start out with some definitions. So let's start out with watts. Whenever we start talking about power training, suddenly the conversation goes from I'm going 18 miles an hour, or the conversation changes from my heart rate's 150. Suddenly the conversation becomes my watts were 280, 220, whatever that number is. It's the new language. So what is a watt? A watt really is the energy required to move a mass a certain distance in a known period of time, right? So watt is a measurement of energy, and this is why we hear it. We talk about it with our light bulbs, and things like that. Watt is a measurement of energy. And in this case, it's applied to how to move a certain mass over a known period of time. Another term that we hear all the time, and I'm just adding it here because it kind of makes it simpler for later, is average power. Well, average power really is the numerical average power put out for a given time measured in watts. So if I said I rode 2 hours at 200 watts, I'm really giving you the average power, the watts in an average. So watts and average power are probably the core terminology utilized in power training. But with that being known, not everybody knows what a watt is. How do we make a watt? Well, a watt is torque, right? And torque is really just force in a circle. That's what torque is, moving in a circle or moving around an axis or an axle, times angular velocity, right? And that sounds pretty complex, torque times angular velocity. But in reality, it's pretty simple. It's how hard you pedal times how fast you pedal. And one of the things as you move into training with power that will really potentially help improve your performance is that you understand you can make more watts in 3 different ways. One, you can pedal harder, more torque, more force, right? Grinding it out. So by pedaling harder, you can increase watts. But you can also increase watts by pedaling faster. And that confuses a lot of people. Not everybody wants to understand that fact, that if you pedaled at the same torque, the same force, but just faster, you're actually putting out more watts. And then the third way you can improve watts are my favorite, right? Pedal harder and faster. Put those two together and you have the best improvement, the best, highest increase in watt outputs. Now that we understand a watt and average power a little better, let's target one more term because it's going to play into our process orientation here. And that term is functional threshold power. And that is simply the highest power a rider can maintain in a quasi-steady state without fatiguing. So functional threshold power, or FTP as it's known, is really like that power you can get up to and hold for a pretty long time. Typically that long time is between 40 and 70 minutes. But to not be over specific, it usually is the amount of, or the pace, or the amount of power, average power you can output for a 40K time trial or an effort in the, let's call it 50 to 70 minute range, right? That's really where you get a good definition of FTP. And that functional threshold power output is the basis of getting started with power and understanding then how to use all the elements. So with those definitions in mind, let's start out with the 7 steps of power training. Now, I break these 7 steps into 2 phases, the data gathering phase and then what I call the performance phase. And this allows us to understand how the process goes forward a little bit easier. So let's start out by talking about steps 1 through 4, which is the data gathering phase. Okay, so step 1 is collect data, and really it's collect and view data. So people ask me all the time, hey Tim, what do I do? I just got a power meter. What should I do right off the bat? Well, the reality is what I want you to do right off the bat is just get power on your head unit, whether you use a Garmin or a Wahoo or whatever, and watch the watts, right? Remember that phrase, watch the watts. And save that data. So you're collecting it and you're beginning to build a pool of data, right? You're saving that data. And really all you're doing is developing a basic understanding of the numbers while beginning to correlate effort to the watts. And this really, the purpose is observation, the stochastic nature of power. You go up a hill and you're surging at 600 watts, and then suddenly you're going down the other side at 100 watts. Remember, the watt is the effort you're putting into the bike. It's the real-time demand. So whatever you're doing, it's showing you that. So that early phase, about 1 to 4 weeks, I just want you to get used to looking at your watts and saving that data. I'd also recommend, though, you do a post-ride review, and that's going to begin to, again, continue to correlate your effort with the number. Wow, that was an average of 180 watts. No wonder it was hard. Or that was an average of 225 watts. That was easy. I guess it all depends on how capable you are, right? But just use the first couple of weeks. I recommend 1 to 4 weeks of just getting used to looking at the data. If you do so, you're going to begin to understand some unique things. One, power is stochastic. And what stochastic means is it looks random. You look at a power file, it's like, it looks like this. The reality is there's actually a pattern in there. As you begin to look at the data more and more, you'll see the pattern more time. Start to look at the type of power you put out. What's your power on a short climb? What's your power on a long climb? What's your power look like when you're in groups? Because it's going to be different, right? So this phase really is about observation, riding, and getting used to just looking at the power and just understand and putting numbers to the exertion level you're putting out. Once we get comfortable with that, the next test is when we really start a more formalized process of working with power in the next step. And that step is testing. So in testing, once familiar with the numbers, the first step of power training is formal testing. I recommend a 3-day protocol for your first series of tests as you get into power training. There are other protocols and other lessons that can help expand on that. But in your getting started protocol, a 3-day protocol will be the best. What is the purpose of the test? Well, we want to basically, one, establish a nice formal protocol, meaning you might not, or you might have, it really depends on your history, have established a testing protocol. So when you're thinking about your first round of tests, which I'm going to show you the protocol in the next slides, try to do it in a way that you can repeat it. The same road, the same section, the same segments, whatever you're doing, you want it to be able to be repeated in the future. The key purpose of the testing, once you get started with power, is to establish that functional threshold power, that FTP that we talked about. As you get introduced to power training, FTP and understanding your FTP is an excellent starting point. As you learn more about training, you're going to evolve beyond that, but the reality is it's a great way to get started and get an excellent basis for building training targets and zones. Third, we want to supply power, information, data to your power profile. A power profile is a look at you, right? It's a look at your systems and how you make power, actually how you utilize energy. And then we're going to set up some training levels with your tests. So the testing protocol will look like this. And I will link this presentation in a PDF format below the video. So day one, we want to test a 5-second max effort and a 1-minute max effort. And a pretty simple process. We get a good healthy warm up with some fast pedaling, in the bank, 5 minutes of easy riding. Then we're going to do 2 times 15-second maximal all-out sprints, standing, seating, rolling at 20 miles an hour, rolling at 12, whatever you think you're going to get maximum effort out. Little rest in between, a 1 minute little rest being 10 minutes of easy riding, then a 1-minute max effort, 5 to 10 minutes in between again, make sure you fully recover, then 1 more max effort. So basically you're testing both your 15-second and your 10-second maxes. Now, what you're looking to record when you're done is your peak 5 seconds out of the 15-second sprint. The reason you're sprinting for full 15 seconds is to make sure you find that right 5-second segment. Not everybody has their best 5 seconds right on those first couple of turns. So you want to just make sure you're getting the max. And then the 2 1-minute tests, compare the two. 95% of you will have the 1-minute max on the first 1 minute, but you also want to get the second one in the bank just to make sure and understand that it's a maximal effort. Day 2, we want to get a max 5-minute test. And the max 5-minute test, same protocol. Good warm up, ride around a little bit, get ready to go, and bam, nail a maximum 5-minute effort. Once you're done, record it, put it in the bank. Finally, we're going to do a functional threshold power test. And the reality is a really good warm up, 5 to 10 minutes or 5 to 15 minutes of easy riding. Then the best way to test, and this is going to be hard, right? And it's going to challenge you. Do a 40-kilometer all-out effort. Do it, which is approximately an hour. I hate calling it an hour because then people will be like, FTP is 1 hour of max. It's not necessarily 1 hour of max. And you can target anywhere between 40 minutes and 70 minutes, but you want a longer test. You really want to make sure you're going harder for longer. So the energy really, or the watt output, the average power that you're looking at, really represents your quasi-steady state, the maximal amount of power you can put out over time. So once you get that, record that average power number, And you can use that average power number as your FTP, that 40 to 70 minute test. And I wouldn't go to 70, I'd say 40 to 60 minutes is probably the right number. There's other alternative FTP tests that I present in my formal education programs and stuff like that, but this is a really great protocol to get you started. I would, again, remember, try to do these in courses that you can repeat. Once we get that FTP test in place, you can go into your TrainingPeaks account or look up or search common training zones. You can find them on our website also. You want to establish those training zones. So you take your FTP, that bases your classic training zones. Now, as you learn more about power, you'll get to a more individualized approach, but starting out with a good understanding of the classic training zones is a great starting point for people getting into power. Why? Because these training zones will help you focus on a desired physiological response. Why we train at different efforts as a whole is our body is driven by two, really three, you might even say four energy systems. Aerobic and anaerobic are the core two ways you would split that. We want to understand our ability to train, introduce targeted stimuli to those systems, and then measure the response that we're getting. We want those systems to get better, bigger, stronger, more effective and efficient, right? So the way we can do that is by understanding our threshold, which really is the transition from aerobic to anaerobic. It's not a light switch, it's kind of a fuzzy gray transition, but it's the point where the system becomes predominant, your FTP, if you're above FTP, your prominent energy source is anaerobic energy. If you're below it, it's aerobic energy. By knowing that split, we can establish some other training zones and intensities that really help you improve your training. This was originally set up, you'll find them in your TrainingPeaks account under the Coggan training zones. Dr. Andy Coggan was the person who developed FTP, set up these training zones. And again, they're an excellent generalized starting point for people new with power training. They've been around for 20 years and they're as good today as they were when they first came out. I'm not going to read through these zones. There are support articles and things like that that I'll post below this video. But the reality is you have 7 training zones. Really, the 7th zone, neuromuscular power, is max. So I'm not sure it's really a training zone, but it is a target. These zones are based on a percentage of power threshold. So once you have your FTP established, that's your FTP. It should really say FTP. I need to update, make sure that is right. So your functional power threshold, you can use a percentage basis. Now, TrainingPeaks and other software will often do this for you automatically based on entering that FTP. But these are the percentage breakdowns. This is what the correlating heart rate would be. Here's your rate of perceived exertion on a scale of 1 to 10. And here's some pretty good time frames, like how long you can hold these intervals or these efforts. So you can do a lactate threshold effort, be somewhere between 91 and 100% of FTP for about 10 to 60 minutes, and still get some benefits. Go up to the VO2 max level, so 106 to 120. You're looking for 3 to 8 minutes. Maybe it's 2, maybe it's 9. These are just good time targets. Once you've done your FTP test, establish your FTP or your threshold power, then this will help you target your training zones as you begin to write workouts, which I'll get into in the second phase and stuff like that. An additional insight slide, and I'm not going to go over all this. Look at the presentation yourself, take a screen capture of this slide. At these different training levels, training zones 1 through 7, these are the physiological responses that we're looking for, right? This is what we expect to occur if you're training in those levels. So a great slide to just spend a little time reading, looking at, and beginning to really understand. Once you have your FTP, like I said, you can really just go into your TrainingPeaks account and set it up and select the Andy Coggan 6. Remember, I just showed you 7, but we don't really count 7 as a training zone. It's just a max target. Pretty simple process. Just click your name in the upper right-hand corner, click to zones, find power, enter your FTP. So you'd find, zones, power, enter your threshold power here. Choose threshold power as your calculation format and the Andy Coggan 6. You can try other zones. I really encourage people, once you start to understand power training, you can see, I will tell you right now, they're all pretty similar. There really isn't a big shift in physiology here and how physiology works, so they're all pretty similar. Then just make sure you click apply. It'll populate the zones for you, save and close, before you get out. Make sure you save those new zones. That will bring all your new training zones into your TrainingPeaks account. When you build workouts and do other stuff, it'll be able to show you those zones in workouts and structured workouts, which I'll show you in a couple of minutes. 4, once you've completed your test, and this is also in TrainingPeaks, right? You get a look at your full power profile, and that'll help you how you understand how you make power. It'll give you more of a 360-degree view of you. It's actually easier just to show you an example. So what the power profile is doing, it's ranking you against world champions, world-class athletes, and then down through from exceptional to fair. And what you're really looking at, don't be overly concerned about how you rank against somebody else. What you're really looking for is the shape of your power profile, because this gives us insight into how you make power, and it gives us insight into areas of relative weakness. And look, if you're going to train with power, you're trying to overcome some of your relative weaknesses, and it'll give you an understanding of areas of relative strength. This is pretty important when you get into annual planning, when you start to think about what is the purpose of my training. You want to train your weaknesses and race your strengths. That might be a little bit of an overgeneralization, but again, getting started is a really good place to start. So when you look at building this power profile as step 4, it is not about comparing you to other riders. It's about better understanding how you make power. I can tell you, like me, I am an anaerobic person, so my anaerobic numbers are higher, and the further you go to the right over the longer test durations, mine just go down and down and down. That means when I'm building training plans, I'm working on the stuff here on the right more as a limiter, as a weakness. I don't need to do as much work on the stuff on the left. This athlete might need to work in the shorter stuff, that's 5 seconds, that's 1 minute, and might not need as much work on the longer stuff. So just understanding you is the nature of the profile. Once you've gotten through that, you've kind of completed the data gathering phase, and now it's actually important to start training, right? I need to use that data for something. And that's what I call the performance phase. So in the performance phase, we start out with this idea of building a training plan. Now, my advice to you is, if you're new with power, is to hire a good coach. Here's why, right? It's like, I always hate saying that in my presentations because it almost sounds like I'm selling something. I'm not. Most people I've watched, and I've been doing this for 15 years, right? 15 to 20 years. Most people spend 2 to 3 years trying to figure it out, or a year trying to figure it out. Maybe they've got bad habits. They've learned some things wrong. Then they hire a coach. And for the first couple of months, they're like, oh, that's what I was doing wrong. And oh, that's what I needed to do. And then they catch up, right? Well, if you're really into power training and you really want to improve your performance, which is why you're training with power, hire the coach first, right? Put the learning curve up front and then determine whether you can go on your own level. Just my 2 cents. But you build your training plan. So in this steps of power training, the next step is you or your coach builds a plan. If you don't have a plan, you don't have a way forward. Not having a plan is planning to fail. You got to have a plan that takes into account this data and develops a long and or short-term power training plan focused on specific goals that lead to performance improvement. That's part of why you want to know your power outputs, right? And your power profile, because you want to use that as the underlying activity in determining your performance plan, your training strategy, your goals, right? Your direction of training. So the plan helps you organize and focus your training. It structures things towards that specific goal, and it absolutely will improve your results. I see still today a fair amount of people who just train by going hard, actually just by going hard every day, which is not the best training, I guarantee it. So you need to build that training plan first. TrainingPeaks offers an excellent ATP, annual training program process that will actually guide you through the training plan development system based on the Joe Friel Training Bible philosophy, which I think is an excellent starting point for new athletes and coaches to utilize. Excellent fundamentals in there. If you're not doing it with using an annual training plan builder, such as TrainingPeaks, and other companies do have them also, I would at least look in and make sure you buy, there's a couple of different great books out there that will walk you through annual training, or watch, I do some webinars, Google search my name and annual training. There's webinars out there where I show, how to do it. So the key though is you understand the strategy and the diagnosis, you've used the power to build that profile, your training plan is specifically targeted towards accomplishing something, and then you get it on a schedule of when you're doing things, what's the progression, how will that training plan flow. Once you have your training plan, you're on to step 6, building power workouts. This is where the specificity of power over heart rate really makes a difference, because you can specifically power or create power-based workouts that support those key goals of your plan, right? If I know I need power in the range of the short stuff, the 1 minute, 2 minute, 5 seconds, whatever, or the long stuff, I also know what I can do in my initial round of testing. I have that basis. Remember, we establish a true fitness baseline, and I can target my training off of that. So the purpose of building power-based workouts, I'm going to show you an example in a moment, really is to specifically target the desired physiological adaptations. Remember, I showed you the chart, training levels and zones, and then the impact of those. And again, this is where a coach can help you guide, or you need to do your own learning, but those physiological responses are really important in your training structure. They need to be built into your plan strategically, when and how much work you're going to do, and they need to be in the workouts. If you can do a workout to build your VO2 max capability, you need workouts that have time and intensity targets that do that. I also think it gives a very clear target, right? It's so funny, heart rate, like if it's really hot out, your heart rate's too high. If it's really cold out, it could be too high still or too low. If you had bad sleep or you've been training, your heart rate might be suppressed. A watt is a watt. Power is power. There's no hiding or lying from it. It just is what it is. When we talk about these training zones or based on watts, this is what a workout looks like in TrainingPeaks. You could do these as structured, and I'll show a sample of a structure on the next slide, but you can even just write out the old-fashioned way what the targets are. This is a workout that I've written that is utilizing the Coggan power zones to show you a range, your power target by the numbers. That means if I'm going to go out and I'm going to do this 4-minute interval, I need to be between 234 and 266 watts for 4 minutes to appropriately strain that system so that I expect it to adapt. Pretty much that simple. Today, most concepts have moved to a structured workout. TrainingPeaks has an excellent structured workout builder. I don't want to get into how to build workouts and structure, but I highly recommend you figure it out. There's great tutorials on trainingpeaks.com, how to use it. But by building structured workouts, you can even increase the precision of the targeting, where it's targeted in a very tight range towards the target of what you have set as your training zones, but even more specifically based on what you can do. And that's really important in the training. Final step 7 is you need to keep that threshold updated and continue to update your zones, right? As you get fitter and you can put out more watts, you need to retest and increase the targeting based on those improved tests. Hopefully increase, right? If they go down, then you're probably doing it wrong. But the reality is, so you're retesting in some timed fashion, which I'm going to give you a good overview in a second. And every time you retest that threshold test, going through that same protocol, repeating your protocol, you need to change your threshold. Remember, I showed you how to do that in TrainingPeaks or whatever system you're using. Change that FTP. That will update your training zones. And this will ensure you're constantly training in the right zone, the right time and intensity targets. It also helps you track progress, right? If your FTP is going up, you're getting more fit. The power numbers themselves, is your 5 seconds going up, is your 1 minute going up? That's just as important. And as you learn more about power, you're going to learn how to read those numbers and use them better and better. What is the ongoing testing format? Well, really, you just need to test on a regular schedule. I recommend your regular testing happens every 4 to 6 weeks. It kind of depends on your training cycle and your life and when you have time and recovery and stuff like that, right? If you can do every 4 weeks, that's ideal. Just do it as part of your training. Blend it into your training. Tests are maximal efforts. There's times when maximal efforts are really good for you from a training sense. Blend it right into your training. Make sure, though, you repeat your protocol, meaning you want to, whatever protocol you use to establish your baseline testing, you really want to try to repeat as much of that as possible. Once you've completed the test and you have your new data, record and track. Did you improve or did you decline, right? You want to communicate that, meaning, in this case, whether you have a coach, you want to, your coach is communicating it to you, you're communicating it to the coach. But it's really important that, you look at that and then communicate, in the sense that, in self-built plans, to me, by looking at those profiles. My 5 second went up, my 1 minute went up, my 5 minute went up, but my longer test went down. That'll also give you a little understanding of how your overall energy systems are responding to the training specifically. Again, I have more advanced topics on that, which you can look at. And then once you have that new threshold, like I said, or that new FTP, like I said, make sure you reset your training zones. Another mistake I see a lot of people who get into more serious training make all the time is they train at the same effort for months, right? And the reality is your body's always improving or not improving. Let's just keep it positive, right? And the reality is, as your fitness and capabilities change, so does your targeting time and intensity for power. That is my pretty much introduction and overview. There is an online certification course over on TrainingPeaks.com. This link will lead it to you. If you did want to take the full certification course, which really this is the introduction to the course, what I just went through with you, please feel free to do so. I'll put the link also below the video. If you have questions about this, you can submit them on our website. We'll be glad to answer. Hopefully that was helpful to you today. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, everybody.